author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
As the media burns itself to the ground, the economy faces pressure courtesy of the Biden administration, and Justice Clarence Thomas has to deal with a level of hate never before applied to a sitting Supreme Court justice. Now, where is the Fourth Estate in these matters, and why is it abdicating responsibility? Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we'll be tackling the economy, the Senate, and speaking with America's #1 syndicated columnist, Cal Thomas, about the state of the media and his latest book examining 50 years of news in the nation. I'd like to take a moment to wish a fond hello to our listeners out in Chester Springs, Philadelphia on WFYL 1180 AM. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com. You can access podcast, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Under President Joe Biden, we hear talk of how robust the economy is. But what of the 3 out of the top 4 biggest American banks failing under his watch and the almost certain recession? How does the White House square this particular fiscal circle? Well, we're fortunate to have back with us economics editor at Liberty Nation, Mr. Andrew Moran. Good to have you back, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, tell me, 3 of the 4 biggest banks, why have I not seen this in the media?
Well, probably because it does shed the Biden economy in a bad light. I mean, just the other day, you had the second largest bank failure in U.S. history with First Republic, and then before that, the Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. And all of this happened because of the Biden administration and the Federal Reserve refusing to admit inflation was not transitory, which forced then the Fed to aggressively raise interest rates. And then that, of course, created a cascading effect and then collapsed those 3 banks.
So this isn't over, though, is it? There's going to be another rate hike soon enough, and the denials are aplenty that inflation is sticky, which appears not to be the case if you look at the numbers, as far as I can tell. So there's no real problem solved by these banks shutting down, is there? It's not as though that's a remedy.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, the Fed is planning to raise interest rates, and then it's going to leave them there around the 5% mark for an extended period of time until they see that their key inflation gouges, which the PCE, that has come down to the level that they want. And then also, if you look at the other regional banks, one of the next banks that many people are really worried about that could collapse is PacWest. Now, PacWest, that stock cratered 36% on May 2nd, and it was so volatile that they had to halt trading. So that regional bank that could be the next tile to collapse. And then you have the whole regional bank ETFs that's been falling. So overall, yeah, this doesn't seem like it's ending. Every time that someone in the Fed, someone on Wall Street, or someone in the White House says, "Oh yeah, the crisis is over," another bank fails. So yeah, so it's probably.
It seems to me that it's almost an avalanche effect. So one tumbles and then sort of builds momentum, taking others with it, because the banking market is, I mean, it's connected by such deep ties, like the amount of money offerings that they share. So, I mean, is there a specific end in sight? What can stop the avalanche, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, I think the Federal Reserve tried doing that by setting up its emergency lending facilities. You look at some of the Fed data, and it shows that all these banks keep accessing this money. So I think perhaps in the short term, the Federal Reserve has plugged that hole. So you're not going to have, JP Morgan collapsing overnight. The problem you may have is that a bank like JP Morgan would keep getting bigger and bigger. So JP Morgan purchased First Republic's assets. So it purchased about $200 billion in assets, plus more than $100 billion in deposits. And so now it accounts for 14% of the nation's total deposits. So that monster keeps getting bigger and bigger. So let's say another bank collapses and JP Morgan says, yeah, we'll do the federal government a solid. We'll bail them out. And then it purchases.
Actually, sorry, Andrew, I want to jump in on that. You've had the purchase by JP Morgan. That happened because the Fed decided to sell it to JP Morgan, didn't they? It's not as though it went out for public offer.
No, so FDIC, they were requesting people to purchase First Republic. Nobody did. It took into receivership and it held weekend bids, or weekend auction,
Right.
and it solicited bids. And apparently, not too many banks put bids and put offers in. JP Morgan was one of the few. So it bought those assets and deposits for just $10.6 billion. So it got
So 300 billion for 10 billion.
10.6 billion. And for some of the portfolio, like that's one of them was an example, is the more 30-year mortgages, they actually entered in a loan loss agreement. So part of the federal government is taking a hit on some of these aspects inside the portfolio. So JP Morgan got a sweet deal on this.
Well, I think if people knew that they could purchase 300 billion, well, 200 billion in assets and 100 billion in deposits for 10.6 billion, I think the market probably would have gone a lot more. I mean, you'd had a lot of venture capitalist investment firms looking to purchase in on that, wouldn't you?
Well, what was interesting about JP Morgan Chase was that you have a so-called cap limit. So I think it was after the Dodd-Frank bill, banks were not allowed to hold more than 10% of the nation's total deposits. But JP Morgan said they were able to circumvent that based on the fact that they took a bank out of receivership, and because they did a favor to the federal government by offering them nice conditions and terms with that deal that they gave the Uncle Sam.
Now, I know that you and I are never big fans of regulations, but presumably the Dodd-Frank Act was in place to avoid even greater catastrophe. And now that's been breached through exception. That means that it can happen again and again. Once it's done once, I mean, that's the floodgates, isn't it?
Well, critics will say that because of that Trump era rollback of certain aspects of Dodd-Frank, that this contributed to the whole banking turmoil. But of course, this is complete nonsense, because one of the things that the Trump rule did was that it raised a threshold for the amount and types of annual stress tests. The problem with the stress test is that it didn't account for things like higher interest rates. What it accounted for was a falling GDP, rising unemployment. So even if all these banks were stress tested every single day, they would have passed with flying colors. You saw that Fed report by Michael Barr, the Fed chair for supervision, and he just pretty much said, it's the Fed's fault for not doing its job, and it's the textbook case of mismanagement. So it had nothing to do at all with the Trump era rollback, which most serious people agree was not the case.
Well, it's Trump has been a convenient fall guy for the last 2.5 years, pretty much. There's the old story, isn't there, that the Russian president, on his way out, he said to his successor, he says, all right, the best piece of advice for you, here's 2 letters, right? Use them only when you absolutely have to, when you're in dire need. That's when you use them. And so anyway, he gets down to business. Crisis comes up and he pulls out the first letter and it says, okay, blame everything on me, is what the first letter says. So he does, and he sails through that. The second, the next big crisis comes along and thinks, I'm going to have to use the second letter. And he opens it up and it says, write 2 letters. And this really seems to me that you can only survive on blame for so long before you become the foil of somebody else's later joke, don't you?
But the problem with Biden, he's never taken any response. He's never blamed himself for anything. I remember a few months ago, he was asked point blank, are you to blame for rising inflation? And his answer was, no, because when I got here, it was already climbing. But of course, you see the data we can know the intricacies and the fundamentals of it. But overall, inflation skyrocketed under his watch. Yeah,
I mean, the same's true of gas prices. At the pump, he's been the White House has been boasting about how we've brought down gas prices that were rising under the previous administration. No. Yeah, sure. You've cut them in half since the high that occurred in your administration.
Yeah.
There's blame to go almost everywhere if you're willing to look hard enough for it. Now, one final question for you, Andrew. There's significant chatter of an impending recession. Now, I'm of the opinion that a recession or recessionary conditions are already in place. But what are the indicators and how is the government responding to this rising chatter?
Well, most Americans would agree with you that the U.S. is already in a recession, or it's about to head into toward a recession. The Federal Reserve, their economists recently admitted that the U.S. is going to head into a recession. All the leading economic metrics suggest that. You look at the money supply data, which a lot of Austrian economists monitor, and that thing has been contracting 4 consecutive months. So, without less money being injected to the economy, without low interest rates, with every weakening economic metric, yeah, the U.S. is definitely headed toward a sharp recession.
And what will that look like going into the election, which for many politicians is all that really matters?
Well, I mean, it's going to be all delusion. I mean, look at when that latest GDP number came in and it said 1.1%. The administration said, "Hey, look how great the economy is growing because it grew by 1% which was and that 1% was driven by what? Consumption by consumers and all three levels of government. If you look inside the GDP report for the first quarter."
It's easy to say, "Hey, look how much is being spent in America today." If you're the one doing the spending, Andrew Moran, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
When people think of Donald Trump's presidential legacy, many consider the most significant act was to get 3 new Supreme Court justices into the highest court in the land. But it appears that Senate Democrats are keen to topple even this. What's the plan? What are the machinations? And will they actually work? We're fortunate to be back with our special Talking Liberty segment here on Liberty Nation Radio, speaking with legal affairs editor, host of the Uprising podcast, and Van Morrison superfan, Mr. Scott DeCosenza Esquire. For all the latest, Scott, good to have you back.
Cheers, Mark. Great to be here.
So, Scott, the Senate Judiciary Committee, they launched I guess what do you call a full-scale rhetorical assault against Justice Clarence Thomas this week. Give us the details, please.
Yeah, I just consider it one more front in the battle lines that the left has been waging against Clarence Thomas. Well, they've really done it for years, but they've renewed those efforts in the spring, and especially since the Dobbs decision and the recent, the Supreme Court's been issuing all these decisions that are not breaking their way, and they seem to be going into conniption fits. And one of the ways in which they're sort of exacting their revenge is to attack Justice Thomas and ostracize him, sort of the Alinskyite model of isolate and attack. And this hearing was remarkable, Mark, because for every kind of allegation or whiff of impropriety or challenging point that Justice Thomas's record might reveal, there was a greater error, challenge, or difficult point for any number of justices that would be on the left block of the court, which animated no criticism or consternation when those things arose. And so it just seems like hypocrisy laid bare when if your guy does it or lady does it and you say nothing, and then when the other guy does and you make hay out of it.
Well, it's British polemicist and YouTube star Paul Joseph Watson, as he likes to say, it's okay when we do it. Now,
Right.
It does seem that all these attacks are focused primarily on Justice Clarence Thomas. Now, I know that you and I both have love for his jurisprudence, but of course, the left is clearly very anti-Thomas. Why specifically him? Because Alito is as, if not perhaps more so, on the conservative spectrum. Gorsuch and Kavanaugh really haven't got the historical chops to match that. But why focus specifically on Thomas?
Well, Justice Thomas himself has said that it's because of the color of his skin and because he's the wrong kind of black person, that they cannot abide that here is a black man who represents really a counterpoint just by his existence and the arguments that he presents as a counterpoint to all their sort of constructive narratives that animate their, writ large, their whole sort of political beings. That's some of my words interspersed with some of his, but to be sure, it is on his opinion, it is about the color of his skin and not meeting up with expectations that they place on human beings because of their skin color, and then what kind of arguments they should embrace and espouse.
If you can try and be a little objective on this, would you say that Justice Thomas's words are accurate?
Well, it's hard to imagine why else they hate him or go after him so much. His record does not reveal a compromised ethical standard, which is how these recent attacks have been characterized. For instance, there was this big hit piece in ProPublica called Justice Thomas and the Billionaire, I think is the title, about this man, Harlan Crow, who Justice Thomas is close friends with and has accepted many generous gifts of hospitality, namely going on his boat and hanging out at his house, which is a giant, lovely place. If you're a billionaire, it's not a tract home down by the railroad tracks, as you might imagine. But there's no implication that A, they're not genuine friends, or that B, Justice Thomas has somehow changed or shaded his rulings because of it. And it's just funny because, other Supreme Court justices have been the benefit of the largesse of billionaires, namely Justice Stevens, I think, and Justice Ginsburg have both been. And again, not a peep said about those. But here's the thing about this relationship with Mr. Crow. Because they are close friends, Justice Thomas is not allowed to rule on any of his anything that would basically be one of his businesses anyway. In other words, it doesn't even matter the financial relationship, right? Just because they are dear friends, once you've established that as a justice, you can't then sit in judgment of a case directly involving one of their interests.
So it seems to me that the Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee, they have, and of course the wider Democratic Party, we've had Representative Alexandra Cortez talk quite openly about the alleged corruption of Justice Thomas, among other Democrats. And it seems that either they want to draw down his reputation as a justice so much that either they can come up with a mechanism for removing him from office, or they can water down the weight he holds within the court by making the case for an expansion of the court. Is that what they're hoping for?
I think so. And also, let's not downplay the notion that they then, when they bring Justice Thomas down, they get to stand on his reputation and beat their own chests and wear their hero's cape. I think it's great politics for almost all members of the Senate Judiciary Committee to do so. They don't put people who are usually in competitive races on that committee, because that's where they want the real partisan hacks to do their dirt, And so as I look at the membership there, these aren't people who are going to have to generally confront red or purplish, voters to justify those attacks. It's red meat for them, and presumably will help not only at election time, but their fundraising as well, when they put these clips of them railing against Justice Thomas' legitimacy, on Twitter and other social medias.
Just a brief point of, I guess, mechanics. Is there a way that Justice Thomas could be removed or be cut off at the legs, as it were?
No. Justice Thomas can be impeached, like any Supreme Court justice can be impeached by the Congress. To do so, they would have to follow the same procedure they use to impeach and remove. By the way, I actually should have stated that it's a two-part process, right? Yeah. So the Congress impeaches and the Senate then votes to remove upon conviction. And that's the exact procedure that would have to be taken to alter in any way Justice Thomas's position in office as Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
Well, it seems with Republicans in control of the House at the moment and an evenly split Senate, that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. Scott DeCosenza, we will keep following this, and please, listeners, do go and check out Scott DeCosenza's article on this very topic on the pages of libertynation.com. Thanks for being here, Scott.
Cheers. Thank you, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back. We're fortunate to have with us today acclaimed author and America's #1 syndicated columnist, Cal Thomas, to talk about his new book, A Watchman in the Night, and the sticky situation America finds itself in with a failing fourth estate. Cal Thomas, thanks for taking the time to join us. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be with you.
Okay, let's start with the new book, Cal. So it's released on May the 8th, and it's called A Watchman in the Night, and it covers your reporting on essentially the biggest stories of the last half century, but it's literally all of them, which is quite a fascinating roundup. Now, it really captured, I think, the zeitgeist of the last half century and brought it all together. In many ways, it's quite overwhelming to realize just how much has happened in the last 50 years. What was the motivation behind writing this, Cal?
Well, I thought as I approached the 40th year of my syndicated column, it would be interesting to look back and see what had changed and what had not changed. And the one thing that had not changed was human nature. You can change parties, you can change clothes and hairstyles, modes of transportation, but human nature never changes. And the remarkable thing is that how some of these political arguments never change. We're still arguing over spending and the national debt. And as you mentioned, the media. So many of these things have been going on for so long. The real problem is that people will not confront solutions, because to actually solve a problem for the politicians means they no longer have the issue, and they'd rather have the issue than the solution, which is really discouraging. We have a $31.4 trillion debt. The interest on the debt is greater than the GDP of many nations, and nobody will cut anything. And no nation has ever been able to survive with this kind of debt. So I look back on these last 40 years as a column writer, and before that as a reporter, and it's not a column collection, but it is kind of a diary on the road to wherever we're headed, and conclude that not a whole lot has changed, unfortunately.
Yeah, you know what? I think the title of the book itself was a really great statement on that, wasn't it? Because it's almost as if you're inviting the reader to be a participant in your reporting. So I won't give any spoilers away, because obviously it's about the last 50 years. But you have the key issues of the year laid out, and then there's Cal's take on what happened, and there's some great anecdotes in there.
Let me just go back to what you were saying about the title. It's taken from the Old Testament. The ancient Israelites used to pose a watchman on the walls at night after the gates were shut to look out for invading armies or other bad people who might wish to do them harm. So without sounding too conceited, I kind of see myself as in their line, a watchman for the encroaching things, the wokeness, the LGBTQ plus I crowd, the people who are undermining public education and university education in America, even Disney and so many other things. I assert that there is a standard. Now, if you go into a supermarket and you go to the checkout stand and you say, well, I have 2 jugs of milk here. Well, but I only want to be charged for 1. Because my standard is 2 gallons equals 1 gallon. The next voice you hear would be security. Yeah. Everybody has their own standard now. You know, in the book of Judges, it says in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that's danger for any culture or society. If you do not have a standard by which to judge right and wrong, good and bad, then anything goes, as the old Cole Porter song says. And
in olden times, a glimpse of stocking, right?
That's right. Was looked on as something shocking. Now who knows? Anything goes, and that's one of our problems in America right now. People are afraid to speak up for traditional values, for right versus wrong. They can't even defend these things or define them because they're afraid of being called any number of phobes.
As you write in the book, well, to me, it seems that there was almost a building crescendo. It was very. I'm sure you're familiar with We Didn't Start the Fire by Billy Joel, where he goes through all the years. And it almost felt like that for me, that there was something building there. And coming back to what you say about how people can't agree on objective values, that itself, though, that's not something new, is it? C.S. Lewis's, we talked about him just before we started recording, his Mere Christianity, the whole first part of that is making the case that there is such a thing as good and bad, obviously being the opposite of what is good, that needs must be agreed upon and exists outside of any definition that can attach it to itself. I think I've explained that badly, but it's a very C.S. Lewis argument
Well, as not to get too preachy here, but I think a prime example of this is when Jesus stood before Pontius Pilate, and Pilate asked rhetorically, "What is truth?" That's where we are today. You have your truth, I have my truth. Even if they are contradictory, as long as each of our truths makes us feel good, it's okay. The late Bishop Fulton J. Sheen, Catholic bishop, used to say America is not overrun by the intolerant or the bigoted. We're overrun by the tolerant. We tolerate everything now, and including debt, including any kind of human relationship. There's a town in Massachusetts which recently passed through their city council a provision allowing polyamorous relationships. So you can have 3 or more wives, husbands, binaries, or whatever, and still be considered a legitimate family, presumably for tax purposes. Not a bad idea if you need more deductions, but in terms of societal...
Everybody needs deductions.
In terms of societal cohesion, it's a train wreck.
Well, yeah, I guess you're right on that, Cal. I mean, it's all well and good for the individual, but it's not looking at the individual moving forward into the future, as in becoming a parent. How does that work? How is there going to be any stability when a polyamorous relationship of 5, 6, or however many people splits up? Where does how does that work for the next generation? It works in a very, I don't want to be judgmentalist, but it works in a very hedonistic manner, as in you're doing this for yourself and not for you're not laying seeds for the next generation, as it were. Now, right. Cal, let's talk very briefly about the fourth estate. We'll talk more about the media later on in the show, but it seems to me, and this is something that your book really brought home to me, is that the fourth estate has generally lost the historical perspective on national and global events. I mean, as in, we're invited to only consider the present and very, very recent past, and only in a way that benefits the favored political party of the day. And there are some exceptions, of course. There's yourself, there's Victor David Hanson, who does some great work. But why do you think that so much of the legacy media opts for this, let's call it like a staccato approach rather than the richer tabloid, which I guess you try to present in your book, try successfully?
Thank you. Well, they share a similar worldview. They read each other's stuff. They go to social events where they only see each other. I had a columnist who I've known for some time in the New York Times call me a couple of years ago about something, and he said at the end, "By the way, are you still writing your column?" I felt like saying, "Yeah, are you still writing yours?" I mean, this proves my point. Yeah. They only read each other's stuff, and it's reinforcement. Now, some people on the right do that as well. They tune in only to those cable channels, or they read only those articles that reinforce what they already believe. That's not growth. You ought to read what the other side thinks, just for your ability to countermand it, if you will. But the polls show, the latest Gallup poll shows that trust in the American media is at an all-time low, down around the level of Congress. I don't know of any other industry that disrespects its potential consumers or actual consumers more than the media. They never respond to these polls. They never ask, well, what could we do to get more readers or more viewers? They don't care. They're insular. They shut out everybody who doesn't agree with them, and they only accept interns or young journalists who share their worldview. If you have another worldview, you're not going to get hired, or you're going to get ostracized if you manage to get in the door. You know, the First Amendment is great, but if you can't afford a printing press, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good.
So very true, very true. We're going to be back with Cal after this short break. And I just want to remind our listeners that A Watchman in the Night is out on May the 8th. And we'll be back after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with America's #1 syndicated columnist, Cal Thomas, whose latest book, A Watchman in the Night, comes out on May 8th. Now, earlier in the show, we discussed his new book. Now I want to move to talk more about the media in general and how it's changed over the last 50 years. Now, Cal, it's often the case that we talk about institutions seeming to be on the brink of failure. It's almost like a chicken little situation. But, you know, we ignore the turbulence that they faced for the decades before. But it seems to me that here, now, the legacy media, it feels a hollow shell of what it once was. Am I wrong in this or not?
No, you're right. When I started out in this business in 1961 as a copy boy for NBC News, younger people watching this will have to Google what a copy boy was. I was surrounded by real journalists. These were men and later women who came from newspapers and wire services, who wrote all of their own copy and who were really interested in conveying truth to the public, that they believed they had a calling to serve. Now we have so much advocacy. You know, the New York Times, Washington Post has opinion sections, but it's turned into all opinion. A friend of mine says the greater power that the media has is the power to ignore. Not only do they slant stories toward the secular progressive worldview, they ignore other stories, especially those that have a conservative or religious or moral perspective. Or if they even pay attention to them, they stereotype them. You know, right-wing MAGA Republicans, flyover territory, you didn't go to the right universities, you don't read the right newspapers or whatever. The public gets this. I mean, we're a nation of over 300 million people in America, and very, very few people now are reading their newspapers anymore, and that's one of the reasons that the newspaper industry is in such decline. At the height of my column, I was in 500 newspapers. Now it's about half of that because people have given up. And again, it's the only industry I know. Let's just take a burger franchise, and the owner says, I'm going to introduce a new line of tofu burgers, and nobody buys them. And he says, well, I don't care if they're not selling. I'm going to continue to push them. He'd be a fool to do that. But that's what they do in the media. You're going to eat this and like it. Well, I'm not going to like it, and I'm not going to eat it, and I'm not going to subscribe to it, and I'm not going to watch it, and I'm not going to buy the products that are advertised. Now, any smart person would say in any other business, I better reverse my position or I'm going to go out of business. If you look in newspapers today, the empty desks, row after row after row. A couple of years ago, I went into USA Today in suburban Washington. There must have been 40 empty desks where there used to be telephones, computer terminals, and everything else. Nobody's there anymore. Nobody's reading. You can see the weather page in USA Today from the front page. That's how thin it is.
You know, you talk about the burger analogy there, and you know, I think the answer to that might be that, well, they're not trying to purvey the news anymore. So they're not trying to sell the regular beef burgers anymore. They're not trying to purvey the news. They're working as gatekeepers, if you will, or even watchmen in the night, as it were, for the favored political party. Now, this credibility issue, it seems that a lot of Americans are starting to realize that the government works hand in glove with this very industry that we're talking about. And just last week we saw President Biden, he had the cheat sheet in his hand for the LA Times reporter with the same question on there. And this is the opposite of the press holding power to account, isn't it?
Yes, well, they want access, and they know, with Hillary Clinton, when she was running for president, story came out that if you don't, that not a Brazil thing, but the word went out, if you ask Hillary Clinton certain questions, then she won't come back on your show. Well, they all want these star guests, and the other thing is that in terms of journalism, so-called, there's a revolving door. Look at the number of people who were in government and are now on TV as commentators, and the reverse. They go back and forth and back and forth. One day, George Stephanopoulos is an aide to Bill Clinton. The next day, he's a highly paid anchor on ABC. I mean, he never covered a school board meeting. He never went to an emergency room at a hospital to cover a shooting on a weekend as a local reporter. He's just immediately dubbed a journalist. Well, that's not the kind of journalism I grew up with. And this is what contributes to the low level of credibility. So many reporters start out with a worldview and then create a narrative and then report the story. You look at the front page, just as I did the other day on the Washington Post. abortion, transgenderism, everything except what really matters to most people. And this is why, again, the credibility is at such a low level. People don't live their lives on the level of transgenderism and wokeism and drag queen story hour in public schools. That's not where most people are, but it's where the media is.
Yeah. You know, it's just as a brief aside, whenever there's a big story that could be deemed damaging to the left, I often just think, right, when I'm looking for an angle on it, the first thing I do is I make a little Excel table and I put down like the top 10 left-leaning news sites, and I make a list of how many times they mention this story. And it's really, I mean, go back, read some of my stuff. Some of these, they just cover things 0%. It's terrible. It's complete abdication.
Look at the Hunter Biden laptop story, reported tremendously by the New York Post, censored by Facebook and Twitter and other social media sites, said it was fake news, said it was Russian disinformation. 51 former U.S. intelligence agency people signed off on it. Has any of them apologized? Have any of the reports, which or the editorials or the columnists who said it was true, retracted? No. Being in the media means you never have to say you're sorry or wrong.
Especially if you've got the president saying the same thing on the debate stage. Now, Cal, can the fourth estate recover, or will it be subsumed by, I guess we call it the new media now, I guess is the most common term. Or is that perhaps, is there always perhaps a continuous renewal taking place, like Prometheus's liver? Is it just being rebuilt again and again?
Yeah, I don't think the media that I grew up with, and maybe you grew up with, you're a lot younger than me, is going to be able to sustain itself. I think the die is already cast, and again, the decline of newspapers, the ratings, the splitting up, and it's not just in this country. I was in Israel last week, had a long conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he said, the same thing is happening in Israel with the hardcore left-wing media always trying to take him down. But he said there's a new conservative television channel that's just come on. It's got about 2% of viewership right now. As people are finding out about it, he believes there'll be more watching. And I think competition is good. The other side of that, though, is people, again, will tune in only to those things that reinforce their point of view. And I think that's dangerous in a free society. We need to know what other people are thinking. We need to know why they are thinking it. And I occasionally learn things from the left that I didn't know, and that's fine. But I find myself far more tolerant and pluralistic and open-minded and all the rest than my so-called tolerant, pluralistic, and open-minded friends on the left.
As you mentioned earlier, we're not in the society we tolerate everybody rather than being intolerant. Cal, final word. Could you tell the listeners where they can follow your work? Please don't list to the 250 plus newspapers in which you're syndicated across the nation. But where can they follow your work, and where can they get your new book, A Watchman in the Night, that's released on May the 8th?
Well, thanks for asking, Mark. You can go to my website, calthomas.com, and see all my columns, radio transcripts, and even order the book through a link there, or go directly to Amazon, Books A Million, Barnes & Noble, or if you're old enough, go to what we used to know as bookstores and ask them to carry it. And probably the tattooed, blue-haired clerk behind the panel, who is a binary liberal, will say, who, what? But he'll order, or she'll order, or he, it, whatever the pronoun is, will order it, and I'd be very grateful. I think you're going to like it. I always say I have a money-back guarantee on all my books. If you don't like them, I guarantee not to give your money back.
Cal Thomas, thank you ever so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark. Pleasure.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Andrew Moran, Scott DeCosenza, and America's #1 syndicated columnist, Mr. Cal Thomas, for taking the time to join us. And of course, extend my appreciation to you, the listeners, for joining us for the ride. Now, my parting shot for this week. As a society, we have a standard expectation that politicians will politic and that the media will inform us of, firstly, what they did, secondly, ask the questions that we want answered, and ultimately call BS when needed. But I suspect that this fairly simple equation lost its way a long time ago. The media rarely tells us precisely what was said without spin. It never asks the blindingly obvious questions that you and I know without doubt would either cut to the heart of the matter or expose the inherent lie. And they never call foul on a candidate or politician that is part of the favored party. The Fourth Estate has abdicated this responsibility. The throne is empty. Who'll step up to take the crown, I wonder? We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.